My name is Alain Arrivé, and I'm a professor at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi. I teach screenwriting, directing, and some other film production classes. Uh, I've been at the university for 15 years now, and the reason I got there partially was the film that I made that got some awards a long time ago in 2007 in Paris at one of the first festivals. Well, the film began as a play, um, a 30-minute play approximately. Um, and I had this idea that that could be my first film after I'd, had it performed a few times with other shorts that I had written, like for the stage. And so it's very dialogue heavy, and it's set primarily in one location. And on stage, it's entirely in one location, which is pretty usual. So I did everything I could to rewrite it, to expand it. So when this central figure that's just called the cowboy, which I played a long time ago, is talking about what happened in his house or on the road in Wyoming, we see those places. And he's talking to this sort of vagrant, this character that's just called the bum, at this diner. And it's very late at night, and they're being served by this waitress who says nothing. She just pours coffee, and she's also constantly writing in the background. So the idea was, in a way, that she's documenting what's happening. And so it's a sort of like, it's hard to explain, but there's a murder in it that you don't see coming, that this entire story had led up to the fact that the cowboy figure had murdered a friend of his wife's who'd been visiting from New York. And so I wanted to set it up as this sort of like culture clash, and express the sort of defensiveness of people who live in the interior of the United States in extremely rural areas. So it's a sort of unusual piece. It's almost absurdist, if you're familiar with that term from theater. It's like people are acting as though things are normal, but you can tell something's off. I was also coming into more political awareness and more aware of the divide between, for instance, my relatives in California and the relatives who had chosen to stay in, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. And it caused me to think about those differences and what would lead to conflict. I mean, you need conflict in a film, right? I mean, unless you're making an experimental film or something. I also was living in Los Angeles and had really started to sour on what I called being a professional beggar, which is being an actor, right? Because you go off and you audition, and the subtext is always, will you please give me this opportunity? And so I wanted to take matters into my own hands and make a film. Once I got to the festival, I was greeted, and everyone was glad to see me, and I started meeting people, and we had this initial sort of little party to greet everyone. I was impressed by how unusual the films were, how diverse the people were who attended. And that's when I started feeling a little excited, like, well, maybe I have a chance of some recognition or something like that. But I was very impressed with the Bibliothèque Nationale, with all of its like incredibly high spaces and bridges that one would walk across over sort of like open spaces underneath, and the large screens. Getting the awards, I was fairly like, euphoric about it. Like, wow, I spent all this money making this 35 millimeter film, and sort of going broke after the final project, and here's some recognition. I remember Scott said they were watching together and they were suddenly like, what? Like, what? This is crazy, It was definitely a memorable experience, coming. And I mean, it was just like, it was my introduction to Europe. Planned when I went back to graduate school to become a professor, and I was fully aware that getting some awards would give me a better chance of getting a job. I started a cinema minor program, and then that became a major, as we would say in the United States, a BFA in film production. Constantly advising on projects. I don't act for my students. They always want me to act. They don't know a lot of people in their late 50s, and they're like, I need someone in their late 50s. Alan's in his late 50s, And I'm like, no, I'm not going to be in everybody's film. And I also don't just hover on the set and make the film happen for them. It's very much about them learning to make things for themselves. My own films, the one I'm excited about working on at this exact moment is my first feature, which is already shot. It was shot on an iPhone with these little moment lenses, which you may have seen, that sort of just go in like a bayonet style where you just put it in and turn it, And I created this concept called small cinema that's not just about shooting on a micro budget. It's about emphasizing plot, theme, character over production value. But I have to admit that I did everything I could with the limited resources that I insisted on using, because I could have just used a 6K Blackmagic camera or something like that from our equipment cage at the school. But I used the phone, a gimbal. I allowed myself 3 little cube lights. All the recording was just with an H6 zoom recorder, most of the time simply on a stand, because I also only allowed myself 1 crew member. So my partner in making the film was a former student of mine who had been a non-traditionally aged student, so he was already in his 40s when we shot the film, Dason Pettit, and it took 1.5 years to shoot. Partially because I used my family as the main characters, and my older daughter, Beatrice, as the main character. And we started out just doing enormous hours and everything. And at one point, my wife was like, how long is this film? And I was like, well, it's a feature. I mean, it's, going to be somewhere about 1 hour and 45 minutes or something like this. And everybody was like, it's a feature, even though I had told them, And so then we went on a more relaxed schedule and sort of wove the shooting into our lives. And then, of course, COVID happened and all this. So this has been a sort of the way I usually work, unfortunately, which is get the thing shot, sort things out, and then come back later to edit because of the demands of my job and things like that. So I'm about 3/4 of the way through the rough edit, and I'm actually editing with someone named Jordan Berger, who was the director of The Surface, which also showed at, ECU. I would say try to find an accessible city that allows you to just get on the set and start understanding how films are made. Because despite the fact that I'm a professor of filmmaking, you certainly don't have to go to school to be a filmmaker, right? You could school yourself. You could go to various people who you're working with, especially if you're young and it's you're in your first few years. People are apt to want to share their knowledge and give advice, and some of the advice is better than other advice and all that, in any instance. But just getting into the sound stages and on these sets outside and actually fulfilling a position, whether it be unfortunately an unpaid PA to begin with, or a grip, meaning moving things from point A to point B over and over again, you'd still be around the process. And then I would also say, because of my preference, there's nothing like having your own material. So a person who has their own 3 or 4 finished, let's say, short screenplays, and these days they'd be rather short. My film Silent Radio was a half hour, by the way. People don't do that anymore, at least in the United States. If it's over 12 minutes, people ask why, right? And 15 minutes tends to be a sort of cutoff now because of the culture of short films, which I think is a real shame because it doesn't teach people. There's no bridge towards making a feature. It's like a half hour, you can do a sort of mini 3-act in 12 to 15 minutes or 8 to 12 or whatever you want to make. It's not really a mini 3-act. It's more like in a way, the structure of a joke, you know? But anyway, getting those screenplays written and getting some advice from people who aren't your parents and aren't your best friends as to whether or not they're understanding what you're trying to express in the screenplay. And actually getting out there and just trying to make your own material while you're working for money, whether it's working at Starbucks or you're lucky enough to be a grip or an electrician on the sets. That gives you some power. I mean, in the US, a lot of people who are considering graduate school don't know this. By far, the most common path towards becoming a financially viable director is getting a degree in screenwriting. It is the most common path towards becoming a director. And I would say the reason for that is that there is the impression that the screenwriter is capable of containing the entire plot, the world building, all of these sort of like big idea components of a film. Knowing the big picture and having other people feel that you know the big picture, I think is key. Advice-wise, I would also say, please don't listen too much to people who say that you shouldn't act in your own film or you shouldn't direct what you write. This isn't the theater. There's no problem with being, in the frame and also being the director. You can just go back and watch playback, which I didn't even have for Silent Radio, by the way. We didn't even know what it looked like until it was all shot. But yeah, you can make a film as you would like to make it. So you've got to find what it is that you make. And so I would say that's my last bit of advice. Try not to fall into the trap of saying, oh, this is trending right now. And then by the time you make your film, something else is trending. If people want to watch my shorts, they could go to alainarrivé.com.